Hi, and welcome back for part 2 of trait theory. Now, if you remember, in part 1 we explored the biological trait theories, and in part 2 we're going to focus on the psychological trait theory branch. Within the psychological view of trait theory, we are considering the role of intelligence, personality, learning, and the criminal behavior. Now, psychology has been researching that theory of trait theory for quite some time, and the criminological application has narrowed and had some researchers look at variables like those in psychology to instead focus on explanations of criminal behavior. Now, we're going to consider the main psychological trait theories, including psychodynamic view, behavioral, cognitive. Now, cognitive, if you want to replace that word of cognitive with thinking, it's really like the psychological term for how we think. Personality and intelligence, and we're going to finish with a brief look at how mental disorders and crime are related. Okay, now in contrast to biological theories that we looked at in part 1, psychological trait theories focus on the mental aspects of crime. And this includes associations among intelligence, personality, learning, and criminal behavior. Psychodynamic theory traces its origins to Freud and his conception of human personality as being comprised of 3 components. And you may have heard these before: id, the ego, and superego. All right. Now, since Freud, he's a psychoanalyst, have continued to view criminals as id-dominated persons suffering from the disorders that render them incapable of controlling their primitive, pleasure-seeking component of their personality. And that's one of the roles of the id. Now, a term, latent delinquency, has been introduced to reference the psychological predisposition to commit antisocial behavior. Now, as a result of the id-dominated personality, is why that would occur, renders the person incapable of controlling impulsive, pleasure-seeking drives. Psychological trait theory also includes behavioral perspectives on crime, in which human behaviors are seen to be developed through a reaction that such behaviors elicit from others. Thus, criminal behavior would be considered by the behaviorist as a series of learned responses to various life situations of that criminal. Now, there's 2 really important researchers in this area. One is Ivan Pavlov, he was a biologist, and B.F. Skinner, a behavioralist. And they influenced in the development of how we learn. Classical conditioning, more specifically, Pavlov did an experiment with dogs, and he conditioned the dogs, taught the dogs, if you will, that's another word for conditioning, taught the dogs to salivate at a ring of a bell, instead of just naturally salivating at food. Well, Skinner really refined the classical model and further improved the model, which is known as operant conditioning. Now, here we act on the environment. We do things on the environment, and this produces some sort of a consequence from the action. And either we repeat the action because the results were pleasant as a consequence, positive reinforcement, or we discourage the action in the future because we got negative feedback. Now, this way, Skinner emphasized the voluntary, active manner that we interact with the environment and learn from our behavior. Now, one subset of the behavior theory is social learning, and the social learning theory made famous by Albert Bandura. Now, in his view, violence is seen as being a learn through exposure to models. Now, models aren't like airplanes and cars. Models in this instance is more like people we look to model our behaviors after. So that's parents, friends, people in movies, even television shows, all sorts of places. Behavior modeling is the mechanism that social learning theorists suggest influence violence. One of the concepts Albert Bandura introduced is what's known as vicarious learning. This just means that we don't need to experience the consequence. I just need to see you experience the consequence for me to learn. For example, you and a friend approach a stove and wonder, is it on? If your friend touches the element and screams in pain, do you need to touch the stove element too? Or perhaps have you learned from your friend's experience? If you learn from your friend's experience, you learned vicariously. This is in part why who we hang out with or live with, friends, family, peers, acquaintances, they can and do influence what we learn, even if we're only in their presence. It's an important element. So here are 4 factors the social learning theorists suggest contribute to violent behavior. First, you need an event that heightens this arousal that a criminal needs. Aggressive skills. An expected outcome. You don't just engage without any what's going to happen and what do I hope to gain. And then fourthly is consistency of behavior with values. Now, for definitions of the 4 factors, you check on page 114 and you'll see a little bit more clarification. Now, a growing body of work is being established in the area of psychological trait theory, known as cognitive theory. Now, this perspective focuses on the mental processes. This includes our perceptions and mental representations of an individual's world, as well as problem solving. That's all a part of cognitive or thinking. Important to know that you should need this. Should you need it, the cognitive is another way of saying our thinking process. Now, under the heading of cognitive theories, we can consider a few sub-disciplines, like moral development, how we morally represent and reason about the world, or humanistic. It considers our level of self-awareness and getting in touch with our feelings. Information processing theory is one that is going through some changes as a result of the technology now available to look at our brain and how we think. As I mentioned, those list of technologies I made mention in part 1. Now, this theory focuses on how we process, store, encode, and then enables us to retrieve and manipulate the information to make decisions and problem solve. That sounds an awful lot like thinking. There are 3 steps to our cognitive thought process, and the first one is, it's pretty clear, and yet we don't always think about it. First is that we have to encode. Now, encoding all information we take in with our senses are encoded. That is, they're put into our brain in a meaningful way through neurotransmitters, electrochemical transmitters, in a meaningful way in order to be able to interpret accurately the world around us. I don't just get up in the morning and go about my business without any awareness of the world around me. I need files to access to know that I don't fall down the stairs or I don't forget to make my coffee, by the way. Cheers. Okay, so first we encode. Secondly is response. Now here we search our minds for the best response and decide on what is the best action to take. So this is going back and looking at our past experiences. And then 3, so encode, respond, act. We act on our decisions. Now this process can and does depend on what we are exposed to and how well we are organized with what we encode in our minds. So we can actually make good decisions. Criminologists suggest that if someone is raised in a family exposed to violence, they can and will learn that violence solves problems. Next, we can consider how criminal personality traits have also been identified. These include impulsivity, hostility, aggression, which have been linked to criminal personality traits. Now, a psychologist, Hans Eisnick, he introduced 2 personality traits with antisocial behavior. And it was on a scale, a continuum, stability to instability, extroversion, introversion. Basically, extroverts are more impulsive and under-aroused. And when when instability is added, neuroticism and the lack of reasonable capacity to make good decisions. It might be involving drugs or crime. It's interesting to note that Eisnick thought these traits were inheritable. That just means you got them from your parents or your grandparents. Criminals tend to be hyperactive, have a short attention span, and conduct disorders, anxiety disorders, and depression. They lack affect. That just means that if you found something funny and your face didn't show it, you lack affect. And struggle to emphasize with others or empathize with others. And we'll get into some terms that fit this much better. And can be very short-sighted and hedonistic. Now, this can make a person more prone to a wide range of psychopathology. Psychopathology is really a term that's used to describe psychological disorders and what it's made of, each one. People in this situation also tend towards traits that reflect characteristics or character defects known as sociopathic, psychopathic, or antisocial personality. And we'll look at each of these to discern the differences. Sociopathic personality. This has more of an environmental influence. It's either through a neglectful home, being involved in abused and having poor educational opportunities, a well-developed consciousness, but they do follow their own values and their own norms, contrary to the dominant culture. Now, sociopathic and psychopathic often get mixed, and they're different. A psychopathic individual personality, this is a psychological disorder with a combination genetic, biological, psychological, and environmental parts. They do not feel guilt or remorse for others. They lack empathy and can be very deceptive and manipulative. But bear in mind, not all psychopaths are criminals. Some are astronauts, doctors, and other such high-risk or high-arousal activities and occupations. Antisocial personality. Now, this is a psychological disorder as well and are characterized by impulsivity, hyperactivity, hedonistic, and lack of empathy to others, and are more prone to deviance and violence. Now, finally, a number of criminologists also believe that delinquents and criminals have lower than average intelligence and that a low IQ is related to their criminal propensity and criminal behavior. Now, this is part of the nature-nurture controversy. Let's look at that just a little bit, because just in case you're not familiar. Nature. Basically, nature is biology, our genetics. Are we predisposed to be criminally minded? Nurture. Well, this is the environment around us. They do accept a little of the role of biology, think socialization, how we're raised. That is, the influence is on us from family, friends, school, just about anyone. So it comes from outside, or as anybody we see as significant to us. Now, we could also look at the connection then between IQ and criminology, and there really has been much mixed views on the link of IQ and crime. However, it appears as though low intelligence may be an indirect connection. Mental disorders and crime. Well, criminologists have determined there must be some sort of link between some offenders that perpetrate more serious and violent crimes may have some form of a mental disorder. Now, one psychological disorder that gets blamed often is schizophrenia. Although there have been some people diagnosed with schizophrenia who have been violent and even killed others. Notably, David Berkowitz, son of Sam, Jeffrey Ehrenberg, he killed an Ottawa sportscaster. But the vast majority of people with schizophrenia are withdrawn and will more likely harm themselves than anybody else. In fact, they are more likely to be victimized. It is a very weak link between mental disorder and propensity towards crime. Mental disorders and violence, well, there's more recent studies have been utilized, a method of analyzing statistical data. It's known as meta-analytic studies. And basically it's a study of studies. They analyze many studies with the meta-analysis to look at many other variables than only the broader categories used in the previous studies. So it's really digging deep in and trying to source out further explanations. So if we were to evaluate the psychological trait theory, well, it's worth noting that both biological and psychological trait theories on criminality have influenced crime control and prevention policies. So to this end, we can consider two programs: primary prevention and secondary prevention programs. Primary prevention programs are any program that is offering information, classes, pamphlets to educate people before there is any problems. That's primary. Secondary prevention programs, well, this level is supporting young people and adults who have broke the law. This can and may be court-ordered or offered via probation officer or even at the end of a prison sentence. Some prisons have even altered prison food, going back to diet, changing the lighting, recognizing learning disabilities and treating allergies, all biological, that the theory at the theory's foundation. And that's interesting that those changes would be made. So behavior modification and individual counseling to offenders are of the psychological view. Cognitive therapy recognizes that there is faulty thinking at the root of bad decisions. So cognitive therapy is aimed at recognizing this and coming up with alternatives to improve thinking towards a better goal. Now, some of the following are included as included in the psychological perspective: coping and problem-solving skills, conflict resolution and communication skills, consequential thinking and decision-making, pro-social responsibility, respecting others, public speaking efficacy, and one big area, and this is difficult, but it's empathy and teaching the role of empathy. Well, this completes our chapter on trait theory. Next week, we're going to look at a chapter on social structure theories, and we're going to consider the role that sociology plays in criminology. We're going to consider the role of social structures in supporting crime, and a couple of additional theories on crime. All right, I hope this has been helpful. I hope you're doing well. Keep up the good work, and don't forget about the assignment. Bye now. Okay. Good.